and welcome to this riveting lecture on art, activism, and environment by Professor Ricardo Dominguez. My name is Kate Huber, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University. It's my honor and privilege to introduce you this talk from Professor Ricardo Dominguez, who is chair of the Department of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego. His experience and expertise bring art, activism, and new technologies together to challenge how we think about migration and material environments. Art, activism, and what I've heard Professor Dominguez call artivism can enrich and shift perspectives as migration, environment, and technology become increasingly interwoven through network infrastructures and in the intensifying effects of climate change. Professor Dominguez is well known for using technology and activism to do what art should do: provoke and disrupt normative expectations. As co-founder of the Critical Art Ensemble and several iterations of the Electronic Disturbance Theater, Professor Dominguez's art has tested the boundaries of activism and environments. In the late 1990s, he created messaging technologies to host virtual sit-ins that blur the boundaries between emerging internet technologies and social struggles on the ground. The Transporter Immigrant tool combined location technologies with poetry and survival strategies for migrants traversing the desert between the US and Mexico. Its ability to neutralize environments weaponized for border patrol prompted investigations by the US Congress, the FBI, and Homeland Security. Like the Mediterranean Sea, deserts along the US-Mexico border are deployed to enforce national boundaries and prevent people from crossing and even surviving. Professor Dominguez's recent exhibition at the Mexicali Biennial used drones to establish a transborder performance in which the border fence was co-opted into the artistic installation itself. Although Professor Dominguez's art and activism focuses on environments and border infrastructures between the US and Mexico, his talk undoubtedly gives us new ways of thinking about art, activism, migration, technology, and the environment here in the Netherlands. As budget cuts chip away at cultural subsidies, political debates persist about immigration and where EU borders should be enforced, as well as what to do about the nitrogen excesses threatening the future of Dutch agriculture and biospheres. To resolve such complex issues, we often turn to technology. And Tilburg University's theme of the art of digitalization in the 2023-24 academic year certainly aims to cultivate innovation for more enduring futures. Yet technological changes are also not always necessarily advancements, as we know from polarizing network infrastructures and the impacts of e-waste. Such challenging and interconnected issues raise questions about technology, migration, and environment that art and activism can help to answer. Professor Dominguez's work in the 20th and 21st centuries has much to teach us about the barriers and borders that connect and divide humans, more than humans, and environments, as well as the artistic possibilities to provoke new ways of approaching the most pressing issues of our time. Thank you for listening to this talk as we collectively work towards more enduring and environmentally just futures.
I will start in a way of allowing a sort of bio of the self so that it can give you a kind of connective tissue. I am what is called an anchor baby. I was born in El Paso, Texas, which is at the border of Juarez and El Paso. Like many, I am first generation, and even though I did not live on the border for very long, only a few months, I can certainly be considered a border baby. Very early in my life, as I said, maybe 6 or 7 months, I was teleported into the future by my family, into fabulous Las Vegas. Now, all of you might know that there was a famous architectural book that came out in 1972 that was called Learning from Las Vegas. And I am really, in the end, the product of learning from Las Vegas. Las Vegas was one of the first 24/7 cities It was about casino capitalism, mafia capitalism, a military industrial complex. That is, 98% of Nevada is military research. You might know Area 51, where the aliens are kept. And of course, the nuclear test site is only 100 miles away. So I grew up watching nuclear bombs being tested above ground and below ground. Certainly a kind of nuclear imaginary of penumbra of the nuclear cloud protecting my family and Las Vegas and the United States from the world that was coming to take possession of our freedom, of our democracy. And so we welcomed the nuclear blast that shook us every month. But at the same time, I was a screenal child. My father gave me a black and white television, portable TV, just for being born. And I had this TV with me at all times, and it presented another way of looking at nuclear realism. On my little TV, I kept seeing films that indicated that these nuclear weapons were not going to protect us, but were going to mutate in the ecologies of the desert, in the desert of the real, monsters that would come to destroy all that we knew. These nuclear forces would transform human beings into raging giant monsters that would destroy the city I was growing up in. So it was a schizoanalytic condition in which the promotion of a patriotic nuclear military industrial complex imbricated with casino capitalism, mafia capitalism, aliens, and the vision of the future was deeply bound to an ecology of mutation and monstrousness. I'll now teleport out of this nuclear blast site that I came into consciousness with. And I guess I should tell you that at a very early age, I began to investigate technology literally in the crib. And I might go back quickly to being a baby and there in my crib with my beautiful screenal TV that I loved more than my family or Las Vegas or anything else. I loved the glowing tubes. I loved sticking my face on the warmth of the screen. And one day, my mother gave me warm milk to drink out of a bottle, leche de mamá. And I decided perhaps it would be interesting to connect the things that were caring for me, this warm tubes of the glowing television and warm's mother milk. And so I poured it into the TV and it blasted open, it exploded, creating great havoc in the home. Not to be over psychoanalytic, but I certainly have repeated this gesture of disturbing the conditions of technology with simple gestures like warm mother's milk. I often repeat it. So I'm now going to teleport to Tallahassee, Florida in 1980. I decided just to drive away from Las Vegas in an old car, and it broke down in Tallahassee, Florida, which is at the north of Florida. It's not even considered Florida, even though it's the capital. It's 20 miles from Georgia. And there, no longer having a working car, I started communicating with different communities there in Tallahassee. I was working in a lesbian bookstore called Ruby Fruit Books, after Rita Mae Brown's famous lesbian novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle. And there I began to encounter individuals and new kinds of books, like Felix Guattari's The Three Ecologies, Siksu and the new kinds of intertextual feminism, post-structuralism. Even though I didn't fully understand it or grasp it, I knew that there was something lurking there. I was very interested in body art and performance art as far as I could tell. I investigated experimental theater. And then I began to meet a group of other artists that became Critical Art Ensemble. There, with the mustache, is Stephen Barnes, the first person I ever met who had looked at a computer and didn't like what he saw. And next to Steve Barnes was Dorian Burr, a photographer who didn't like photography. I was a performance artist there in the middle who didn't like performance art. Next to me with the big earrings is Hope Kurtz, a poet who didn't like poetry. And next to Hope is Steve Kurtz, a filmmaker who didn't like film. So you could see that we wanted to quit our work. And so we quickly started investigating new types of making. And so often the FBI and Homeland Security and institutions that critique our work often say we use poetry as a secret shell for other things, but I'm showing you now right here in this image handmade poetry books that we would gather together and make as a community there on the table. Now, why is this poetry important? Because it led us to an idea that we developed called utopian plagiarism. Utopian plagiarism was a way to come up with new ideas very quickly. And so you could cut and paste new words into older text. So we were reading Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience from 1848, where he promotes actions against the Mexican-American War and develops the theory of civil disobedience. So what we did using utopian plagiarism is we added the term electronic, and there we had electronic civil disobedience. And this became a key concern for us in the early 1980s. What would electronic civil disobedience and why would electronic civil disobedience be necessary? We began to investigate what we imagined was the emergence of virtual capitalism, a virtual capitalism that would give value to data bodies and remove value from real bodies. And if indeed virtual capitalism was being assembled in the 80s and it would come into full being in the 90s, we needed then a contestational gesture like electronic civil disobedience to not only disturb the conditions of forthcoming virtual capitalism, but we also needed to suture the ways real bodies would encounter this space. Another element that developed in the 80s was micro gestures. Micro gestures were ways to investigate public space, public culture, without directly protesting or transgressing. We began to investigate what were early forms of capital called malls. Malls were these new entities in the 1980s, especially in Tallahassee, Florida. We wanted to investigate what malls were about. They were basically about the freedom to buy, the freedom to be under surveillance, a simulation of the public agora. And so I would go into this new mall, buy $20 worth of goods, and instead of taking these commodities home, I just broke them out right there at the edge of the mall sidewalk, a Burger King hat, some Hot Wheels music. Soon a public gathering would gather around this invisible theater of microgestures. Security would emerge, and suddenly people would start discussing, is this a Vietnam vet? Is this a drug addict? Is this a houseless person who doesn't understand what to do with commodities? So while we weren't protesting or blocking, we were enunciating that microgestures would allow power to walk on stage, to enact the conditions so that communities could have a conversation about what malls and levels of security really were. By the mid-80s, many of our friends began to die. An ecology of a virus began to infect our community. We didn't know what it was, but soon it came to the foreground that it was something called AIDS or HIV, and there was hysteria, and there was uncaring with the Reagan policies around how they were not considering a small group of individuals who were considered homosexuals and therefore unwanted were being killed, even though it was an expansive planetary scale, endemic, if not pandemic level. Dr. Fauci was brand new at NIH at that time. And one of the things that AIDS did was that it forced electronic civil disobedience to come to the foreground for critical art ensemble, not just as a gesture against virtual capitalism, but as a way to enunciate what we call cultural vaccines. We began to develop a local ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was part of ACT UP New York, ACT UP Atlanta, ACT UP Miami. ACT UP was global. One of the things that ACT UP did was begin to bring together for a critical art ensemble street activism, as well as what we would call at that time community science. One of the things that ACT UP foregrounded for us was that we needed to begin to implement community science. That is, those individuals being hit by this HIV needed to meet the question of how pharmaceuticals were establishing the protocols of therapy, how Dr. Fauci was implementing funding for rapid testing. But much of the practices of that are now de rigueur for HIV came out of ACT UP research. That is the 3 cocktail system, new rapid therapeutics, having people with the disease being on the committees that developed the protocols, that shifted the bureaucracies. So this was a really key moment for Critical Art Ensemble to start bringing together electronic civil disobedience, community research initiatives, and a wider on-the-ground activism. So this then began a series of tactical media gestures where we would fax jam or call jam different communities and corporations, pharmaceuticals or the NIH. For instance, in Tallahassee, Florida, where we live, a very large store that everybody went to buy their groceries and pharmaceuticals at decided not to sell condoms as their response to AIDS and HIV. We thought this was wrong. So we would call them, we would fax jam in 24 hours a day saying you must sell condoms. But then we decided we should do this in a proactive consumer way. We said we would love to buy more things at your store like condoms. And after 3 weeks, they said, okay, ACT UP, we will sell condoms in our store. We celebrated and said, can you put the condoms at the front of the store? Because we're in a hurry sometimes. But they did agree to these kinds of policies. So at that time, Critical Art Ensemble then began to try to create a performative matrix of research and practice where we would develop ways to articulate what the performative matrix of virtual capitalism would be and how these tactical media gestures that we had done with ACT UP, Community Research Initiative, tactical media, would be implemented in the 90s. And the other thing that became important around these kind of cultural vaccines was that in the mid 1980s, two other things came to the foreground for us. Number one was that the Human Genome Project had been initiated in 1985. If you remember, the United States put in a great deal of funds to map the entire human genome. We felt that probably what would happen is that research would be done, and then at some point the corporations would take ownership of our genomic structure, that is, of a clone capitalism, which is indeed what eventually happened. And so we began to think about intervening around the bioaesthetics into this rushing clone capitalism. The last level of capitalist integration would be nanotechnology. In 1986, we read Eric Drexler's the futurology of nanotechnology that would be assembled controlling particles almost at a subatomic level. And we thought this would be the formation of another wave of capitalism, particle capitalism. So in the 80s, this performative matrix of virtual capitalism, clone capitalism, and particle capitalism was going to be a key area for our electronic disturbances. We continued to do performance work, and we wrote a series of books. Electronic Disturbance was one, and Electronic Civil Disobedience and Other Unpopular Ideas. They were not published until the mid-90s, but they were really written in the 80s when you read them. But they proposed that in the 90s, we will need to create an anonymous cell of 5, we always work with 5 high-level technologists who would create the tools to disturb each of these protocols of the new capitalisms that would be assembled using trespass and blockage to shut down virtual capitalism, virtual particleism, and clone capitalism as it moved forward. In 1991, working with Wolfgang Stahler, a conceptual artist in New York City, we established Thing.net, an internet service provider for activists and artists in New York City, where I had moved in order to put into practice electronic civil disobedience, let theory hit the ground. I needed computers, and working with Wolfgang, we started early computing infrastructure. By 1992, we had Thing.net in Argentina, in Cuba, in Amsterdam, in Berlin, in Vienna. It was a global network that gathered communities around the world on bulletin board systems and Move. You have to remember there was no browser or internet the way we know it now. But infrastructure was a key condition of aesthetics, the aesthetics and politics of infrastructure. And it was here that I began to investigate the early protocols by the RAND Corporation, the military think tank here in the United States, had begun to establish in 1991 what they called the future of cyber war, cyber terrorism, and cyber crime. Cyber war is coming, they said. 2 scholars from the military, Ronfeld and Aquila. I began to investigate how they articulated these 3 areas. They never mention electronic civil disobedience, and they certainly don't mention art, what I was calling cyber poetics. So in 1991 and 1992, working at Thing.net, learning to be a systems administrator, I began to see how I could intervene in redefining their dreams of the profits of profitable economies that cyber war and cyber terrorism, cyber crime would bring to the unmentioned cybersecurity. Cybersecurity would bring great riches to everyone as long as cyber war, cyber terrorism, and cyber crime were developed. And I felt that electronic civil disobedience and cyber poetics would destabilize and disturb those kinds of virtual capital profit centers. But something happened that changed all of that theorization. As you might remember, the first browser, Mosaic, was created at the CERN Institute. It was hot links and an interface. Here, a new kind of window is created, this browser, in 1993. And this really shifted a lot of thinking for us as artists and activists. The other thing that happened that really changed everything was that in 1994, 1 minute as 1994 began, the Zapatistas ripped through the electronic fabric. A group of indigenous rebels in southernmost Mexico in Chiapas ripped through the electronic fabric and within a few hours established the first postmodern network, as the New York Times said it. They did not have electricity. They did not have telephones. They did not have the internet. They did not even speak Spanish as the dominant language. Yet very quickly, the Zapatistas understood that cyberspace was a key component for the establishment for a new arena for indigenous futurity. And I was online that night and became part of the digital Zapatista movement. I invited Zapatistas to come to New York. They came and looked at the theories and practices that we were developing for electronic civil disobedience. They were really interested, but they said, Ricardo, it shouldn't follow the protocols of anonymity, of high-level technological resources. It should have a different kind of, as you say, cyber poetics. It should have a Zapatista cyber poetics, and you need to translate that for the commons, for the common good of the communities, no longer just for a set individuals. So working with the Zapatistas, doing actions on the ground as is traditional, I began to assemble using this new web portal, this new browser, to gather together Zapatistas around the world, offer information, and begin to think what would be a cyber poetics, how would it work, how would electronic civil disobedience stay away from anonymity, from high levels of technological intervention. Using early real, See You, See Me. I don't know if you guys remember See You, See Me. It was before Zoom and Skype and real video, tiny little postage stamps. And I was asked by MIT to do a year-long show in 1996 called the Rabin Alaki Zapatista Port Action at MIT, in order to gather Zapatistas together and begin to assemble electronic civil disobedience. Indeed, it did happen. In 1997, Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0, which is Stephen Ray, the gentleman with the beard, a scholar on information war and the drug war in Mexico from University of Texas at Austin. Next to him is Carmen Karasik, a leading bug hunter, a code hunter at MIT. She ran our servers. If there was any issues with your code, Carmen Karasik would resolve it. There I am in the middle, and then you see Brett Stahlbaum there at the top. He was a new media artist in San Jose, California. We never met all together at one time. It was completely digital. We worked together for about 10 years, developing the Zapatista FloodNet system, allowing us to communicate with everybody, the Zapatista poetics that drove virtual sit-ins. Now, virtual sit-ins use the agora of the network, of the browser. As you might know, browsers have reload buttons. You go to a website of your favorite website and you go, this is yesterday's news. So you hit the reload button, the refresh button, and it goes to the server. It knocks on the server and says, give me the new page, refresh it. So that's what we did. We created a refresh button where people could gather together and do virtual sit-ins against the Mexican government who was attacking the Zapatista communities in southernmost Chiapas. The other thing that it did is upload 404 files not found. It's part of the public agora of browsers. So, for instance, if you go to your local newspaper and say, I want to know about Rubber Ducky Ballet number 85, the system will say 404, Rubber Ducky Ballet number 85 is not found. It's just telling you that doesn't exist on the server. What we did is we uploaded into the Mexican government, the Pentagon, and other communities that were attacking the Zapatistas, and we would upload. Does justice exist on this government website? And the government website would say 404, justice not found. Is democracy, 404 not found. So we weren't hacking the system, breaking into it, trying to get secrets. We were just indicating what didn't exist in these systems: democracy, justice, the voice of the indigenous. We also did it transparently. Electronic disturbance data did not hide. Our data bodies and real bodies were connected. We would let the Mexican government and the Pentagon and anybody else know who we were, what we were doing, where we lived, what the code was being used, so that our cyber poetics was not secret, was not anonymous, it was fully transparent. And so this really confused the authorities. They launched the first known information weapon at us, the Pentagon did. The Mexican government got very angry. Congress called us cyber terrorists. But again, because we were transparent in our poetry, this kind of level of information war, of cyber terrorism, cyber crime, cyber war could not be attached to what we were doing. A digital Zapatismo allowed us to jam the NSA with Jam Echelon Day in 1998. We had a battle with the Pentagon, and here you can see on the front page of the New York Times, 1998. If the electronic disturbance data wasn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. The U.S. Department of Defense Department. So here we created an electronic disturbance, a cyber poetics that used the conditions of data bodies to disturb the regimes of data power and virtual capitalism and all the integrated militarization. Out of this, then, we were invited for the first time by artists in Tijuana, Mexico, in 2000. I had never gone to the border, even though I was born on the border. And electronic disturbance theater went to Tijuana, San Diego, Tijuana, and they asked us to do artivist, hacktivist gesture. So what we did is a Zapatista tribal port scan. As you might know, the Zapatistas have a paper Air Force of poetry that they launch against the military with words of peace and power. So we used the Zapatista Air Force model and did port scans of Custom and Border Patrol here in the US servers. As you might know, computers have about, I don't know, 785,000 plus doors or port scans. We often only use 2020, 8080 for email and videos. And so we would port scan the US government Border Patrol servers. And every time we found an open port, an open door, we would shoot a Zapatista poem into the system. The US government got very angry, said that we were trying to crack the system, but we said we are sharing digital culture, Zapatista poetry, to allow that community to have a sense of the culture of the border, of poetry. In 2001, early 2001, we were invited by the anti-deportation class group in Germany, which was the No Borders community, the Cologne Performance Art School or School of Art, 1968 anti-prison abolitionist German groups who invited electronic disturbance theater to come train them and teach them about electronic civil disobedience. What had happened was that Lufthansa and the German government were mummifying refugees and immigrants on these commercial flights. And so they couldn't scream, and then they would be thrown off the plane wherever it landed. And that was this kind of corporate governmental model of deportation. Well, because of the way people were mummified, a number of refugees and immigrants were asphyxiated and died. So this community asked us to help them take down and shut down the deportation class action. We publicized it. We said we were coming. We were doing a virtual sit-in and e-protest. We took over Lufthansa. We dressed like Lufthansa pilots and stewards and passed out anti-deportation class information. We let everybody know for a month that we were going to do this online demonstration, and it did work. We took Lufthansa offline. We took over the stockholders meeting. The pilots union and steward union said they would never do or support another deportation class action. Now, one of the things that is interesting about this particular action is that it's the only time that we have gone to court. A year later, this was 2001, in 2002, of course, post 9/11, we were brought on charges of being cyber terrorists at the Frankfurt lower court. The lead administrator for the abolitionist anti-prison group in Germany was fined 10,000 euros. But we said this was wrong. This was done as civil disobedience, electronic civil disobedience, not cyber war, not cyber terrorism, not cyber crime. This went up to the higher court in Frankfurt, and they overturned the lower court and said that the German community have a right to do electronic civil disobedience. So that's the only specific case that's ever gone all the way through the courts. Because of these actions, I was then hired by the University of San Diego, UC California, San Diego. I was now a professor. I never thought I would teach in a university. I was an independent artivist. So in 2004, I was hired by a transdisciplinary research group called CalIT2, California Information Technology 2, to do three things: continue to explore the use of supercomputers for hacktivism and electronic civil disobedience against corporations, nation states, and I was particularly interested in using it against the UC system. Two, to develop electronic disturbances on the border. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew there was a long history of border art and environmental art on the border, and I was going to participate. I also needed a nanotechnology lab to begin to investigate particle capitalism. I went down to the border and just stood there with my UCSD, looking at the future, looking at what indigenous futurity had brought to me. And very quickly, Border Patrol showed up. They said, you cannot stand happily on the border. You must move forward. So obviously, I could disturb it quite easily. This is the border as I found it, really, under surveillance, large walls that have a long history of being installed and defining who comes in and who comes out, who has citizenship, who doesn't, who must have the bear the weight of not being in the north. Even the cacti of nature are watching one. So it was a surveillance system. I was quite interested in how the environment, how the policies of 1994, Operation Gatekeeper, was pushing humans into the most dangerous territories in the world, literally prevention through deterrence, as they said, which meant that they were pushing immigrants to places where they would literally die in high numbers as a policy of the US, nature and environment as a killing machine, and promoting that, and surveillance was attached to that. I began to investigate the history of UCSD, of University of California, in relation to this kind of borderization of surveillance, or what I call not just deterrence through prevention of nature and its use as a killing machine, but how was virtuality used as a deterrent? And I quickly found out that my university was part of a large-scale Vietnam War virtual fence between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, led by leading scientists here at UCSD, working with the leader of the Vietnam War in the US, McNamara. The idea was that you would have these drones called bat cats that would take in information from sensors about the movement of North Vietnam. These sensors were chemical and sonic. If you've seen the King Kong movie, Skull Island, you literally see them using these sensors to find King Kong. Then all this information from the drones was sent to ships offshore Vietnam, where IBM had monitors that would allow you to see where the North Vietnamese were, and where you could then drop many bombs. But the thing was, the North Vietnamese were incredibly smart. They quickly discovered they could put buckets of urine, of piss next to these sensors, and the sensors would send messages to these early drones. Here are all the North Vietnamese. The US would go bomb that area where the piss buckets were. And of course, the North Vietnamese would route around this virtual fence, if you will. So what happens to systems that were developed by the military? They were and failed. They were sold to the US Border Patrol, so that by the mid 70s and early 80s, US Border Patrol was attempting to use these systems, but they always failed to really articulate. So that was where Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 comes in. Here you have this virtual deterrence system. Here you have this environmental space that's being used as a killing machine. The desert was being turned into an environment not for the support of nature, but a denaturing towards killing. We could see the Mediterranean as being part of that history of prevention through deterrence that the US has developed. So working with my old colleague, Brett Stahlbaum, poet and scholar with the glasses, Amy Sarah Carroll, Behind me, Ellie Mermad, mixed reality and musician artist, MFA of mine, Misha Cardenas, a trans artist. We developed the Transporter Immigrant Tool in 2007. The idea was to use a very old type of phone, very new, I guess I should say, old for us, using this new global positioning system that was given to us by the military in 2000. This idea was that we would move away from a global positioning system to a geopoetic system. We put information out on newspapers that this transporter immigrant tool would allow you to navigate the desert, find areas that would protect you and give you water and directionality. This was the i335 from Motorola. This is the actual phone that was created. Your smartphone is like a super computer compared to this. The poetry was developed in a way that took military survival manuals from the Chinese military, US military, Mexican military, Israeli military, about, like Tom Cruise. He crashes in the desert, he can survive. And so we translated and created poetry that would allow people to survive. They would understand that reading a barrel cactus that always points south. So if you want to go north, look at a barrel cactus. It also had a haptic vibrational element. If you were dehydrated and lost, you would vibrate and lead you in the right direction. The poetry was in 12 languages, in Finnish and Russian and Chinese and indigenous languages, because many people crossed the border. We had signage about the tool all over the Southern California area. This was one of the poems in the system that disturbed people. So this poem and all the other poems really scared the FBI, my university, Congress. As you can see here, explicit poetry, GPS phones help illegals. What really scared the government was, and this is amazing, if you tell students poetry really scared everybody. So we were accused of being traitors to the nation. The university tried to detenure me. We were under investigation for 3 years. The FBI wanted to know what the poetry meant and how it would dissolve the border. It took 3 years, but we finally won all the cases. This is a book that we wrote of the poetry that has it translated in different languages. We also had the poetry as code. Code was poetry. The FBI was very confused why we would consider code as poetry. They also asked us if poetry was encrypted. We said all poetry is encrypted. I've read Shakespeare's sonnets for many years, and I still don't know who he loves. We also wrote plays about the transporter immigrant tool. We also had water barrels in the desert with poetry that the GPS tool, the transporter immigrant tool, helped people navigate the killing environment that was established. The other element that became really important in encountering this kind of work was that our university is at the center of what is called Drone Valley. We produce 80% of all the drones, unmanned aerial vehicles used around the planet. The Predator drone, the Reaper drone that was used by Bush and Obama in Iraq War II and Afghanistan, that continually are still used by Homeland Security to guard the border between the US and Mexico. And my university produces 80% of the code that is created. So I had to teach a Photoshop class, and so I was explaining this to my students. So we created signage around the campus to indicate to what degree drones that kill were at home in our community. And suddenly a drone crashed near our iconic university library, Dr. Seuss Library. Soon all over Southern California, people were concerned about why drones were crashing. I became the leader of the University of California, San Diego Center for Drone Policy and Ethics to investigate. There you could see our mascot, the Triton, holding the drone. And out of this project came this idea of the singing border drone, the palindrome, that would be a copy of the Predator and chase Homeland Security drones and sing the culture of the border. I began to do testing with new kind of everyday drones, the idea that perhaps they could go out in the desert and help people wandering in the desert, communicate with them as well, not only Homeland Security drones. And then recently, Electronic Disturbance Data 3.0, we did a series of drone crash and dialogues around what the Border Patrol is doing, using simple drones to enforce policies that kill. Here, the Border Patrol was trying to stop us. Here is one of the singing border patrons in Calexico, Mexicali. Here you can see a moment of us. Anyway, it was an interesting encounter. And here's a hat that we were wearing, Make America Greater Mexico Again.